Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the Historical Society of Carroll County's Box Lunch Talk. It's June 20th or July 20th. Boy, I keep saying June for some reason. July 20th, 2021. And we are here to bring you another wonderful Zoom program with Thomas Crocker as our lead speaker. Before we get going, I just want to welcome everybody to the organization. And I want you to know that we will have an opportunity for questions at the end. The way you do it is you go to the chat function at the bottom and you can type in your questions, and those questions can be loaded right in while the presentation is going. And Lynn Wheeler will be taking those questions at the end. Another way you can do it at the end is you can raise your hand and indicate that you want to be spoken to. And again, Lynn Wheeler will call on you. So how we're going to do this is we're going to have our speaker introduced. He'll do his presentation, and at the end, you'll have your questions. Until then, I would ask that you please mute your voice in the Zoom, partly because even now I can hear some background talk from people who are chit-chatting with their partners there, and sometimes doorbells go off and dogs start yapping. So if you would please
get up a minute,
mute yourself, that would be great. All right, so we're ready to begin. At least I'm just dying to hear about this speaker today. And Lynn, will you please do the introductions?
I'm delighted to do the introductions of Thomas E. Crocker. First, let me give great credit to Sue Bloom. Tom and Sue are cousins through the Week family, distant relatives, and we're so thankful that Sue brought Thomas to us today. Thomas E. Crocker is a native Washingtonian. He is a graduate of St. Albans School, Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and Columbia University Law School. From 1975 until 81, he served as a Foreign Service officer, specializing in Portuguese and West European politico-military matters, base negotiations, and expansion of NATO. For many years, he was a partner in the law firm Alston and Bird, LLP, where he co-headed the International Trade and Regulatory Practice Group. In addition to Empire's Eagles, Mr. Crocker is also the author of Braddock's March, How the Man Sent to Seize a Continent Changed American History, which received the 2011 Distinguished Book Award from both the New York and District of Columbia Societies of Colonial Wars. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Tom.
Thank you very much. Let me just get set up here. Can you see the slideshow okay?
No, you have to share your screen, Tom, the bottom button that says share screen.
I thought I did. Hold on.
The bottom of the Zoom screen shows a share screen.
Yeah. I clicked it. Let me try again.
There you go.
All right.
Now, there you go. Okay.
Can you see it now?
That's perfect.
All right. Very good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This story begins at sunset on Sunday, the 18th of June, 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte is in desperate flight from the battlefield at Waterloo. The Prussians and the English are hard at his heels. Racing to reach Paris, he abandons on the road his bulletproof coach and imperial necessaire containing a fortune in precious gems and cash. Will he stand and fight again, or flee to the United States? Reaching Paris early in the morning of the summer solstice, the mud-splattered Napoleon stops to languish in his bath at the Élysée Palace while reading Alexander von Humboldt's diaries of his travels in America. He dispatches his younger brother Lucien to plead with the Parliament to authorize him to reunite with Marshal Emmanuel Grouchy's intact cavalry corps and fight one more time. But he's too late. The Marquis de Lafayette and secret police chief Joseph Fouché have established an interim government. They have had enough. Napoleon abdicates the following day and resumes his flight. There's no question where he is going. As early as 1812, he and his older brother Joseph Bonaparte, the King of Spain, had selected New Jersey as their bolt hole. Napoleon envisions a new role for himself in America as a scholar and savant, surrounded by his family and devoting himself to his avocations of geography, science, and mathematics. Before he resumes his flight, Napoleon orders proactive measures. He directs the imperial treasurer to transfer 3 million francs in gold to the United States. He orders his aides to organize transportation to America of most of the imperial library, as well as sufficient china, linens, and furniture from Malmaison to furnish the large townhouse and a country estate. He packs 20 hunting guns and orders his groom with 15 stable boys, horses and saddles, and equipment to sail for America. His aides even take out subscriptions for various Parisian newspapers to be delivered to Napoleon in care of General Delivery, New York. The immediate and pressing question is how to get to the United States. Napoleon orders 2 French naval vessels placed at his disposal and requests that secret police chief Fouché issue passports. Fouché demurs and passes the request to the Duke of Wellington, thereby tipping the British off as to Napoleon's plans, but all the while conveying to Napoleon that their issuance is imminent. Napoleon and his entourage flee southward toward the Atlantic port of Rochefort as the Prussian and British dragnet closes in. Events later show that the 2 naval vessels ordered by Napoleon are under strict orders from Fouché never to carry him to America. When Napoleon belatedly begins to realize this, he must come up with a proverbial plan B. To try to catch Napoleon, the British are closely patrolling the coast in the huge ship of the line Bellerophon, affectionately known to her men as the Billy Ruffian. As one British sailor puts it, nothing can escape our Argus eyes, eagerly looking into every rat hole for Napoleon Legrand. Napoleon therefore opens secret discussions for Plan B, to escape on the French naval corvette Bayadere, which lies at anchor near Bordeaux. The captain of the Bayadere, Charles Baudin, who you see here, is a one-armed Huguenot.
Yeah, I gotcha. No, I think. Well, look at Tyler. You know, he's barely.
I'm sorry, somebody's speaking over me. Can you please mute? The captain of the Bayadere, Charles Baudin, is a one-armed Huguenot who later goes on to a distinguished career as an admiral. Intoxicated by Napoleon, he is more than willing to help, even though he judges his corvette to be no match for the Bellerophon. He joins with the ardently pro-Bonaparte U.S. consul at Bordeaux, the gimlet-eyed William Lee, to devise a plan. Together, they determine to sacrifice the Bayadere in an engagement against the Bellerophon, while Napoleon and a few key aides slip out on a Baltimore ship, the Pike, which lies at anchor in Bordeaux harbor. Now, the Pike is not an ordinary U.S. merchantman. She is a heavily armed U.S. privateer just freed up from service in the War of 1812. She is present in Bordeaux under very murky circumstances for British sympathizers against the British and apparently operating under the control of U.S. Consul William Lee. Baltimore privateers like the Pike were renowned for their speed. With their raked masts and ample sails, these so-called Baltimore flyers used the wind more efficiently than other ships. Handled properly, they cruised at speeds of 11 or 12 knots versus 5 or 6 for ordinary warships. On the rare occasions that the British captured them during the War of 1812, they proved virtually useless because only their specialized Baltimore crews knew how to handle them. But back to the Baudin-Lee plan to save the emperor. Napoleon approves it and instructs Captain Baudin to await further instructions. Those instructions come a few days later when Napoleon orders a highly secret nighttime mission to Bordeaux by his trusted right-hand man, Lieutenant General Charles Baron Lallemande, who is the deputy commander of the Imperial Guard Light Cavalry at Waterloo. Lallemande is a singular character, high energy, creative, and as Napoleon said of him, possessed of the sacred fire. Meeting with Baudin and Lee in Bordeaux at 2 o'clock in the morning, Lalemant and his co-conspirators activate the plan. They order the Pike and Bayadere to break free of the British blockade and to stand by to receive Napoleon and his aides off the coast by the port of Royan. The ships proceed and are waiting. Meanwhile, Lalemant returns to Napoleon at Rochefort. In a critical council of war, he argues adamantly for Napoleon to board the Pike forthwith. However, by this time, Napoleon is engaged through proxies in parallel negotiations with the captain of the Bellerophon to surrender to the British, thinking he could buy a country estate outside London and live a life of leisure. Despite evidence that the British have a spy in Napoleon's entourage, they remain utterly clueless about the plan involving the Pike. As Napoleon prepares to make an imminent decision, an unexpected factor intervenes. Royalist forces seize territory around Royan. To escape, Napoleon must travel to the port in disguise. This, the ever-proud emperor views as beneath his dignity, and in literally the last hour, he scotches the American escape plan for the British option, to his everlasting regret. Several observations. First, if Napoleon had sought to escape on the Pike, his chances of success would have been significant. If Captain Baudin's Bayadere had run interference as planned, the ultra-fast Pike likely would not have been caught. Second, the U.S. consul in Bordeaux, William Lee, was a dangerous freelancer. He knew full well the British intent to stop Napoleon, but he nevertheless took affirmative actions to facilitate his departure for the United States, actions which could have resulted in a hostile naval engagement with the Royal Navy and the loss of life. Had this occurred, the negative effect on U.S. relations with Great Britain, with which the United States had just months earlier concluded peace, would have been significant and possibly long-lived. Moreover, it would have violated the Madison administration's policy of strict neutrality in the war between Britain and France, and it also could have poisoned relations with the new Bourbon government in France. Lee's actions were foolhardy. Third, this story illustrates the latitude and discretion with which diplomats worked in the early 19th century, when communications were not as they are now. Today, the decision would have been made in Washington, most likely by the White House, not even the State Department, and communicated instantly for the in-country diplomats to execute. Diplomacy in the 19th century put a premium on the intelligence, character, and wisdom of the man on the scene. Unfortunately, Lee lacked all three. However, Empire's Eagles involves much more than Napoleon. In the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo, a veritable exodus of marshals, generals, and regime insiders made their way to the United States. Spurred by prescription lists drawn up by Fouché, many came under aliases and on the lam. The list reads like a who's who of the top echelon of the leadership during Napoleon's 100 days. Indeed, never before had so much of a nation's military or political class migrated to the United States. Napoleon himself estimated that over 300 high-ranking Bonapartist military men fled to America. Some estimates run as high as 30,000 when taking into account their families and entourages, as well as economic refugees. To a remarkable degree, their destination was one city, Philadelphia, which soon became known for its glittering recreation of Parisian glamour. They were aided in this choice by three factors. First was Quaker Philadelphia's reputation as the second largest and most sophisticated and tolerant city in the United States. Second was the residence in Philadelphia of one of the wealthiest men in America, the French-born Stephen Girard, who not only financed the War of 1812, but also helped provide a safe haven for his fellow countrymen. Third was the presence in Philadelphia of a colony of white French-speaking Dominicans who had fled the slave revolt of 1791 in what is now Haiti. Mostly shopkeepers and artisans, they had little in common with the formerly powerful and cosmopolitan newcomers, but they nonetheless provided an established Francophone community onto which the newcomers could graft themselves. Chief among the new refugees was Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother, the King of Spain. Joseph was a lawyer and a diplomat and a very different man from his younger brother. However, because of his strong physical resemblance to Napoleon, he offered to substitute himself for his brother in order to facilitate his escape, but Napoleon declined. Joseph had his own hair-raising escape incognito from France to America, during which he left his wife and daughters behind. He first lived in a townhouse near Washington Square in Philadelphia, which still stands. But Joseph preferred life in the country, and he purchased an estate called Point Breeze, perched high on a bluff near Bordentown across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. He lived here for most of the rest of his long life. The mansion was quite spectacular. A visitor allowed into his private apartments provides a peek. The curtains, canopy, and furniture were of light blue satin, trimmed with silver. Every room contained a mirror reaching from the ceiling to the floor. Over the bed hung a splendid mirror and also one over the table. The walls were covered with oil paintings, principally of young females with less clothing about them than they or you would have found comfortable in our cold climate. In every room of the house, there were statues of Napoleon in different positions. Now, in a secret cabinet in his study, Joseph kept a collection of jewels, including the crown and the rings he wore as King of Spain. The public rooms contained a gallery with a notable collection of paintings by masters, which reportedly included works by Rembrandt, Titian, Raphael, Rubens, and Da Vinci. On one wall hung a full-scale copy of David's dramatic Passage of the Alps, showing Napoleon on a rearing horse and with cape flowing. In a sharp departure from formal French and indeed European and American garden design at the time, Joseph developed the grounds as a carefully planned naturalized wilderness or picturesque landscaping, complete with bridle paths, secret bowers, and an artificial lake with swans. He based the concept on his chateau in the Picardy region of northern France. The result was little short of revolutionary in terms of garden design in America, and indeed it influenced Frederick Law Olmsted's design of Central Park. The property was riddled with mysterious brick tunnels, supposedly for quick escape from assassins. Unfortunately, the Point Breeze mansion no longer stands, but remains of its tunnels do, and there's one on the slide as it exists today. While living at Point Breeze, Joseph took an American Quaker, Annette Savage, as his mistress. By her, he had 2 daughters and descendants alive in America today. Point Breeze, moreover, became a salon for the exiled Bonapartists. Joseph was far from a recluse. People came to him. He was popular with his neighbors who called him the good Mr. Bonaparte. Visitors from Philadelphia arrived at Point Breeze by a 16-oar barge that Stephen Girard gave him. They included many exiled French officers. There they drank deeply of their memories of the past and plotted, while Joseph merely listened. Although they tried to recruit him to their plots, he scrupulously declined. He became a staunch admirer of George Washington and American democracy, and he even undertook a pilgrimage to Mount Vernon to pay homage at Washington's tomb. Another prominent refugee was Marshal Emmanuel Marquis de Grouchy, the aristocratic commander of the Cavalry Reserve Corps at Waterloo, who, under a death sentence, also settled in Philadelphia with his 2 sons. So too did the just mentioned General Charles Lalemant of the Sacred Fire. Following Waterloo, Lalemant made his way to America in disguise after being imprisoned by the British on Malta and wandering through the Middle East. He joined his younger brother Henri, also a cavalry general, who was already here. Other prominent generals included Napoleon's former aide-de-camp, Charles Count Lefebvre Desnouettes, who, as Lalemont's immediate superior, commanded the light cavalry division of the Old Guard at Waterloo, and the rough and pillaging General Dominique Count Vendôme, the division commander of the 3rd Corps at Waterloo. So bad was his reputation that Napoleon once said that if he had 2 Vendômes, he would have to order one to hang the other. And the list goes on and on. These men were people who had spent their entire adult lives fighting all over Europe. They knew no other trade. Not surprisingly, they soon got into trouble. The trouble focused on 2 utopian schemes. In the first scheme, the Bonapartist refugees in Philadelphia lobbied the Madison administration and Congress to make a concessional land grant in newly captured Creek Indian territory on the Tombigbee River in Alabama for a colony to grow wine and olives. The idea seems to have first been floated by U.S. Consul William Lee, who was back in the United States after having been forced out of his post at Bordeaux. Known as the Society for the Cultivation of the Vine and Olive, Lee was its first vice president and chief lobbyist before being hired by Madison to redecorate the burnt-out White House. The idea was quickly picked up by the French-language newspaper in Philadelphia, L'Abeille Américaine, or the American Bee, and attracted the interest of many of the Napoleonic emigres. Lee's efforts succeeded, and Madison signed the grant into law on his very last day in office. It was a boondoggle by any measure. Over 90,000 acres granted at concessional rates. Nonetheless, French settlers moved to Alabama and started the backbreaking work of clearing the land and planting crops. Needless to say, it was not a success. Lost in the shuffle was the fact that certain prominent Bonapartists in Philadelphia never went to Alabama. Instead, they pledged their claims to bankers in that city for significant ready cash loans. Chief among these was Charles Lalemant. And what was Lalemant going to do with that ready cash? The answer, in short, was to invade Texas in a scheme to place Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Mexico, notwithstanding Joseph's refusal to go along. On his very first day in office as Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams received an intercepted package of letters. Written by a prominent Bonapartist emigre, the letters sought support for a secret French military expedition to enter Texas and set up a mini-state which would work in collaboration with disaffected elements within Mexico proper. Given the delicate state of Spanish America at the time, this was the approximate equivalent of Adams being handed a sizzling stick of dynamite. Now, guess who showed up in Adams's office the very first day to help? You got it, former U.S. Consul William Lee. Adams dispatched the ubiquitous Lee to ascertain the intentions of Lalemant and warn him off any precipitous action. The matter quickly escalated into a major diplomatic row between Adams and the French, British, and the Spanish ministers in Washington, as a nervous Adams suspected complicity by one or more of them in the plot. The matter boiled for some months as Adams fretted about it in his personal diary. At length, the indispensable William Lee reported to Adams that he had met with Lalemant, who denied the plot. Lalemant was, of course, lying. The expedition was already underway. Several hundred former French soldiers arrived in Galveston, where they fell in with the pirate Jean Lafitte and waited for reinforcements. The Bonapartists and the pirates quickly formed a mutual admiration society. Eventually, with aid from Lafitte and some 400 to 600 strong, with only a handful of women and children, they pushed off into the interior of Texas, where they set up a military camp that they christened the Champ d'Asile, or Field of Asylum. It was a curious place. From the start, the camp was run as a military operation. The approximately 100 officers were organized into 3 companies of infantry, foot cavalry, and artillery. After completion of the fortifications, regular military drills occupied several hours each day on an improvised parade ground. An oversized tricolor hung from a large tree at the center of the encampment. They evidently didn't possess a flagpole. Each night, a watch was mounted around the camp. The old soldiers would sit by the central bonfire, grandly called the Palais Royal, and discuss their former campaigns. Less happily, desertions and duels began to proliferate, and Lalemant resorted to placing sentries around the perimeter of the camp with orders to shoot any deserters. But the ultimate purpose of the colony remained vague. Its attempts at agriculture were perfunctory, a few melons and a dream of cultivating tobacco. Lalemant offered his services to Spain, thus confirming Adams's suspicions, but the viceroy declined his offer, thereby refuting those suspicions. There was inconsistently talk of aiding Mexican insurgents and throwing off the Spanish government in exchange for a fast ship to liberate Napoleon from St. Helena. Lalemant authored a manifesto that articulated the philosophical underpinnings of the Champ d'Asile. It was picked up by major U.S. newspapers and eventually by the press in Paris, where the plight of the exiled soldiers mourning the loss of their country struck a nostalgic chord. A subscription was opened up to support the colony. It gathered close to 100,000 francs, none of which ever reached the Champ d'Asile. A song was composed in the colony's honor, which became popular in the Parisian cafes, and various artists churned out idealized paintings and lithographs of the little corner of France in the wilds of Texas, such as the one shown here. I love the palm tree with the sign on it reading Place Marengo. Meanwhile, the situation grew increasingly dire on the ground. The Spanish authorities in San Antonio determined to oust the demoralized Frenchmen. They sent an expeditionary force which surrounded the Champ d'Asile. Without a shot being fired, the French capitulated and returned to Galveston, where they lived in destitution along the beach before dispersing. The Society of the Vine and Olive and the Champ d'Asile were both utopian experiments gone wrong. Elements of them were high-minded. In their published propaganda, their founders held them up as an exercise in the civic virtues of antiquity. The examples of Cincinnatus returning to the plow and of George Washington figured in their philosophical musings. So also did elements of Rousseau's social contract. However, in both cases, the utopias represented an image of America seen by European and more particularly by French eyes. And in the case of the Champ d'Azile, that image became blurred and haunted by the Napoleonic epic. In their military routines and campfire reminiscences, the soldiers were no longer following Cincinnatus as a model, but were little more than homesick retirees trying to recapture their past glory. Both utopias encapsulated a static ideal of small landholders happily tilling their plots within a supportive localized community, a concept as Jeffersonian as it was Jacobin. The static ideal was singular in its impracticality and lack of knowledge of the context in which it was being attempted. What the ideal failed, and failed utterly, to take account of was nature in America, nature in the form of geography, distances, climate, weather, crops. It also failed to take account of human nature, greed, boredom, loneliness, despair. The combination proved fatal. With the collapse of the Champ d'Azile, General Charles Lalemant settled in New Orleans. He became a U.S. citizen and purchased various properties and slaves on credit, on which he defaulted. He wound up in London, where in 1825 he became an agent for the insurgent Greek government, which wanted to purchase warships to fight against Ottoman rule. He returned to the United States and negotiated for the construction of 2 frigates. There were cost overruns and allegations that Lalemant absconded with thousands of dollars. However, with the 1830 revolution in France that placed Louis-Philippe on the throne, Lalemant's fortunes turned. He could now safely return to France. The remainder of Lalemant's career proved felicitous. He became governor of Corsica and inspector general of the military academy at Saint-Cyr. He died a peer of France in 1839. Certainly, Napoleon's judgment that Lalemant possessed the sacred fire was not wide of the mark. He was an energetic and creative officer who pushed the boundaries and who probably would have saved Napoleon from St. Helena if he had only listened to him. But his actions in America showed another aspect to his character. He hijacked the Society of the Vine and Olive to pay for the Champ d'Azile. He operated in great secrecy. He repeatedly failed to account for funds entrusted to him, and he cynically manipulated both US and French media to inflate the strength and success of the Champ d'Azile, probably in order to increase its attractiveness to the highest bidder, be that the United States, Imperial Spain, or the Mexican insurgents. That he was a world-class adventurer, few would deny. Now to turn to the 200-year-old mystery surrounding Michel Ney, the Duke of Elchingen, Prince of Moscow, Marshal of France, and Napoleon's bravest of the brave. You have only to look at his portrait to know that he was a man of gravitas. The question is this: was Marshal Ney executed by a firing squad on December 7, 1815, and buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris? Or was the execution staged, and did Ney in fact join the other Napoleonic refugees by escaping France to live as an obscure schoolteacher named Peter Stewart Ney in the rural south of the United States? First, a few words of background on Marshal Ney. He was an ethnic German born in Sarre-Louis, France in 1769, which was the same year as Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington. Sarre-Louis was then in France, but now in Germany. He was from a modest background, but received a good local education and apprenticed to be a notary before enlisting as a private in the French Hussars at age 19. Following the French Revolution, the officer ranks were open to commoners, and Ney's rise through the enlisted and later officer ranks was meteoric. He was a superb horseman and swordsman and a born leader. He was known as Le Rougeaud, or the Redhead. His campaigns throughout the 1790s were mainly in and around the Rhine. At this stage, he was not in Napoleon's orbit. He was first promoted to brigadier general at age 27. He declined the promotion because he did not think he deserved it, as he did subsequent promotions only to be overridden by the government and ordered to accept them. In a career that lasted 27 years, he fought in literally hundreds of engagements and battles and was wounded multiple times, sometimes severely. He was a soldier's soldier, a man of the field, not a political general. Ney first met Napoleon in 1801 when Bonaparte summoned him to Paris because of his nascent reputation. Ney had never before visited Paris. Bonaparte maneuvered to attach Ney to his persons and fortunes. He even enlisted the aid of his wife, the future Empress Josephine. She introduced the young hero to the woman who would become his wife, the dark-haired beauty, Aglaé Louise Augier, who was a close friend of Josephine's daughter, Hortense, and subsequently a later-in-waiting to the Empress. Looking at her face, you can almost sense the mixture of beauty and tragedy. When they married in 1802, Ney was a battle-hardened 32, and his courtly bride was barely 20. It was very much a love match. Ney was devoted to her, and together they had a total of 4 sons, 3 of whom are shown here. The youngest one, depicted, Eugene, dressed in red, twice came to the United States and may have played a role in the story that unfolds. In any event, scores of battles ensued in which Ney distinguished himself, earning Napoleon's sobriquet of the bravest of the brave and his elevation to the Marshalate in 1804. His crowning achievement, however, came in his command of the retreat from Moscow in 1812, in which he literally saved the Grande Armée, or what was left of it. It is a harrowing and indeed heroic tale told in the book. Now, to fully appreciate the scope of this disaster, I draw your attention to the famous 1869 map and statistical graphic depicting Napoleon's invasion of Russia, prepared by Charles Joseph Minard. Note the size and route of the invasion in red, and the dwindling size of the French forces on the retreat in black. Ney went on to play a critical role in Napoleon's first abdication, for which Napoleon never forgave him. And Ney swore allegiance to the newly restored Louis XVIII when Napoleon was sent into exile on Elba. When Napoleon landed in France for the 100 Days, Ney famously promised Louis that he would bring Napoleon to him in an iron cage. Instead, Ney flipped and with his troops joined Napoleon. Still not fully trusting Ney, however, Napoleon held him at arm's length until Waterloo. Then he summoned him. Ney was in effect the field commander of all French forces at Waterloo and personally led the final charges of the Old Guard against the British squares. He fled after the battle, fully intending to seek refuge in the United States. One second, I have an interference here on my screen. So he fled after the battle, fully intending to seek refuge in the United States. Instead, he was arrested, tried by the Chamber of Peers, which was the upper house of Parliament, sentenced to death, and executed on the Rue d'Enfer, or Hell Street, in Paris on December 7, 1815. Or was he? Note in the print the distraught priest on the left and the commander of the firing squad averting his eyes on the right. Two pivotal characters whose roles are dissected in detail in the book. Indeed, rumors started circulating the very day of the execution that Ney had not really been killed, that the firing squad was composed of his old soldiers, and that the execution was faked, and that Ney had escaped. Using secret police reports, diaries, and other records, many never published in English before, Empire's Eagles uncovers multiple active plots to free Ney during his imprisonment and trial. It also examines a host of questions surrounding the execution, the firing squad and bullets, the handling of the body within the nearby maternity hospital to which it was taken, and the very odd circumstances of his burial in the dark and in a double coffin. Note this near contemporaneous print based on an eyewitness sketch which shows Ney dead but intact. Who produced it and why politically is explored in the book. So there we have the short story of Marshal Ney. Against this background, Empire's Eagles examines analytically the complex evidence of whether a school teacher who called himself Peter Stewart Ney was in fact Marshal Ney. Peter Stewart Ney was a man of great mystery. He appeared out of nowhere, but left a profound impression on almost everyone he encountered. He first appeared in South Carolina in the fall of 1819 and established a sterling reputation as a somewhat itinerant schoolmaster to the children of the local gentry for the next 27 years. He bore a strong resemblance to Marshal Ney in terms of hair and eye coloration, height, build, age, and personality. He was immediately suspected of being Marshal Ney because of this resemblance and because of his many war wounds, martial bearing, horsemanship, and swordmanship, as well as his undefined foreign accent. All agreed he was highly intelligent, well-educated, and intimidating. French soldiers who had fought under Ney visiting the United States saw and approached him thinking he was the Marshal, but he always backed away. Many, but not all of his students and their parents thought he was Marshal Ney, a fact that he did not deny when occasionally in his cups. He was an ardent Bonapartist, highly secretive, had intimate knowledge of Napoleonic battles and of Marshal Ney's family, and had many character traits and habits that matched those of Marshal Ney. To cite but one, they both played the flute. When asked by his attending doctor on his deathbed just hours before he died who he really was, he replied that he was indeed Marshal Ney of France. The matter remained one of local lore and legend until it began to be picked up by newspapers nationally about 10 years after his death. Empire's Eagles takes a fresh look at all the evidence with an open mind and in light of modern databases, internet sources, and other means. The methodology of the book is simple. The Peter Stewart Ney story collapses if it can be proven that 1, Marshal Ney in fact was executed on December 7, 1815, or 2, because of differences between Marshal Ney and Peter Stewart Ney, they could not have been identical, or 3, there is evidence that Peter Stewart Ney had an identity other than that of Marshal Ney before coming to America. This slide shows the most famous and accurate depiction of Ney's execution. The artist interviewed one and maybe more eyewitnesses to produce it. Note that in it, Ney fell face forward and that the word vive is scratched in the wall. But back to the story. Not wanting to spoil a good mystery, I will only say that the book examines the execution and its immediate aftermath in great detail, looking at the plots to free Ney, the people who had access to Ney during his imprisonment and trial, the composition of the firing squad, the position in which Ney fell, the damage done by the bullets, or lack thereof, and the manifests of various ships on which he is alleged to have escaped, among many other factors. Looking at the second prong of the analysis, whether there were differences between the two men so that they could not have been identical, the book examines a host of indicia, including the startling fact that at least 5 wounds on the body of Peter Stewart Ney matched exactly 5 known to have been borne by Marshal Ney. Think about that for a moment. There are many resemblances, but this area is complex and nuanced, and there is indeed some problematic evidence. However, you'll simply have to read Empire's Eagles to explore this mystery. Finally, the book examines the third prong of the analysis, whether there is evidence that Peter Stewart Ney had an identity other than that of Marshal Ney before coming to America. In other words, if he were not Marshal Ney, then who was he? Was he French? Was he German? Was he British or Scottish? Did he fight for Napoleon? Or did he even fight for Wellington? This hypothetical is probably the most fascinating mystery of all. The book examines various possibilities, but discards them all. At the end of the day, Peter Stewart Ney remains a mystery. He once described himself as an atom floating on the atmosphere of chance. His story is a poignant one of human tragedy, an immigrant warrior who washed up on the shores of America in the wake of Waterloo, and who very much wanted to return to his wife and sons in France, and yet at the same time to be lost to the world. I want to close by saying you've seen a number of paintings of people today. It is rare indeed to see a photograph to look into the actual face of an officer who fought under Marshal Ney at Waterloo. Here is a daguerreotype of Colonel John Jacob Lemanowski of the 9th Polish Lancers. Note the saber scar on his cheek. He too fled to America after Waterloo. He settled in Indiana and became a Lutheran minister and lecturer on the Napoleonic Wars. In the early 1840s, he spent a day and a night talking with Peter Stewart Ney, and yes, he was certain that he was Marshal Ney, the hero of France, the bravest of the brave. However, you be the judge. Empire's Eagles, the fate of the Napoleonic elite in America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for that fascinating and very, very interesting talk. And we all have to wonder about whether Ney was here or not. That is great. I have a few questions I'd like to, a few follow-up questions I'd like to pose, if I may, while other people are getting their questions. Your research is amazing. We have a lot of historians in the audience. Can you talk about some of the primary sources you used? What was most fascinating to you? You researched a lot of newspapers. As a researcher, are you concerned about the loss of print newspapers?
Well, let me start with the first part of the question. The archival research was really all over the place, starting with the Library of Congress and the U.S. National Archives to get the diplomatic correspondence that was going back and forth during the 100 Days and the time of Napoleon's effort to flee right after Waterloo. It also involved well, besides just the diplomatic correspondence, it involved diaries kept by John Quincy Adams and other people, which is available online now, and original documents held in the New York Public Library and at Columbia University and at the rare book collection at the University of North Carolina. There's a big depository of relevant material. Also, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia was very important. And I did have access to the name materials in the French National Archives, which obviously is in French, and a lot of it's never been translated into English before. I also got was able to access some unpublished materials, reminiscences by people involved in French, never before published, as well as the secret police files and the Army materials on Ney. So it was really all over the place. There's a lot in here that has never been published before, I can tell you that. As far as the newspapers, yes, I did spend a lot of time looking at newspapers as well as ship manifests from the period to try to track these people and see how they came here. It does concern me that we're not going to have the archival materials available in the future because of the internet, and it's a sad loss because when you read these newspapers from the time, it's really like being a fly on the wall. You see what people are thinking about and what's going on, and they were actually very thorough newspapers reporting on these events, such as Ney's trial was heavily reported on as it was going on. So the answer is they're invaluable.
Well, thank you very much. Your research is absolutely incredible. Today, given the focus on immigration, it is complicated to get into America. How would it have been in 1815? Would President Madison have welcomed Napoleon with open arms?
No. Lord. There were no visas required then. They could simply get on a ship and come, and just, ship docks and walk off. Now, a lot of these fellows came under aliases. They were afraid the British would intercept them as they were coming here, and indeed, as you read the book, they almost did in some cases. Joseph Bonaparte was almost captured by the British right as they were coming into New York Harbor. So there weren't the immigration laws that you have in place today. These people just showed up, and it did not make the top levels of the U.S. government happy. They were very concerned about it. They were nervous. They didn't know what these people were up to, and you see this concern evidenced in the personal diaries of people like John Quincy Adams and the official correspondence that the Secretary of State had with the president. Joseph Bonaparte tried to call on Madison at Montpelier, his house in Orange, Virginia, and the president did not want to see him, and he sent one of his top officials to warn him away to not come to visit him. The U.S. government had a very clearly articulated policy towards France at the time, which was supportive of the monarchy while Napoleon was on Elba. And this is an interesting point because Napoleon came back and he was literally in power for almost 100 days only. There wasn't sufficient time for news of that return to come to Washington and for instructions to be sent back out to Paris to the U.S. diplomats on the scene. It happened so quickly. And that goes to the point about communications being very different back then. So again, the importance of judgment of the diplomats on the scene was really paramount, and they had to react quickly and without instructions from Washington. So the U.S. government was not happy about this. And eventually, just to round it out, it became apparent that Joseph Bonaparte was not going to be a threat. And eventually, President Monroe did call on him at his house, Point Breeze in New Jersey. And when Lafayette came on his tour of America in 1824, he he actually stayed with him, and they spent quite a lot of time talking together. So
Thank you very much.
it eventually settled down.
One final question I have, and then we'll open it up to others. Carroll County connection with the Napoleon family is through Betsy Bonaparte. You cover the marriage of Betsy and Jerome Bonaparte in your book. Can you talk a little bit about Jerome, Betsy, and their heirs?
Yeah, well, it was a Napoleon didn't approve of the marriage. He didn't want her marrying an American commoner, and Napoleon's attitude towards America was very transactional, I must say, as you discover when you read the book. He really didn't know much about America at all, other than the fact that he sold his Louisiana Purchase. Yeah, he disapproved, and he tried to get the Pope to annul the marriage. They did have a daughter. The Pope refused to annul it, and so Napoleon annulled it himself in rather typical Napoleon fashion. And Jerome eventually remarried somebody else in Europe. But the daughter did survive, and when Napoleon III was on the throne much later in the century, she did go to Paris and was recognized as legitimate Bonaparte by Napoleon III. She had, I believe it's either her son or grandson, became the Attorney General under Teddy Roosevelt. And he looked pretty much like Napoleon. There are photographs of him. So it's a very interesting family. If you go to the Maryland Club, there's a portrait of one of the sons of descendant who looks very much like Napoleon as well. So it's a Baltimore story and Carroll County story. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Russell Dick has a question in chat. Does the Point Breeze area of Baltimore City along Broning Highway have a historic connection with Joseph Bonaparte's Point Breeze?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, it's a geographically a long way from Bordentown, New Jersey. So it's an interesting question. I've never actually looked into that, but to the best of my knowledge, it probably is coincidental.
All right, thank you. And Chris McMasters has a question. Are any of the battlefields in Europe well preserved for visiting? I assume they mean the battlefields pertaining to this book. Yeah. Yes,
well, Waterloo certainly is. It's just as it was then, because they recently had the 200th anniversary in 2015 of the battle, and they built a new visitor center. I was there in 2015, just as that was about to open, and there's a mound that the British built on the battlefield. It's very high, and you can go up the top of it and look out, and it gives you this panoramic view of the battlefield. And it was a very complicated battle fought in several different locations, but from that vantage point, you can see it, how it all sort of hangs together and makes sense. I think some of the others are pretty well preserved too, the major ones. So yes, the answer is a lot of them are.
Thank you.
There's a lot of interest in them there.
Karen Conner asked the question, what happened to Ney's wife and children after Ney allegedly came to America? Did she believe he was killed? If not, did she try to join him in America?
That's a good question. She believed he was killed. There was never any question in her mind that he was killed. And she and her 4 sons spent the rest of their lives trying to get him pardoned and vindicated. Or, I mean, of course, it was too late if he was killed, but for his reputation. It's a very sad story. The secret police were hounding them. They really had to leave France. They went to Italy. She married a French general under some very murky circumstances. It was a morganatic marriage, and I certainly don't think she would have remarried if she had thought he was still alive. So that's one of the arguments that for the case that maybe this fellow in the United States was not him. But then again, maybe she didn't know. She was not buried with him in Père Lachaise Cemetery, nor is she buried with her second husband. She's buried in her family gravesite on the outskirts of Paris. So it's very strange that she was not buried with Ney if he's really buried in Père Lachaise. So it's a tragic story. The last living descendant of Marshal Ney, the last known one, died in 2006, and that's another reason why, you know, one obvious answer is, well, can we do a DNA test to see if these are the same people? And we can't, because we don't have any descendants of Marshal Ney that are known to be living today. The body of Peter Stewart Ney in North Carolina there's probably no DNA. They exhumed him in 1887. It was in very bad shape then, so there's probably no DNA available there. So that's sort of a rambling answer, but she led a very tragic life, and she was a lovely person. You can tell.
Yes, it was very tragic. Yeah. Would anyone in the audience like to pose a question to Tom? If so, you can go ahead and unmic. We have a question here from Jerry Klauber. Jerry, go ahead.
There's a myth that Ney taught school in North Carolina. And if he was buried, where in North Carolina would he have been buried?
Well, they do know where he is buried. He's buried in Rowan County, North Carolina. It's a rural area, sort of in the middle of North Carolina near Charlotte. He taught all over the place. He taught in South Carolina, he taught in North Carolina, he taught in Virginia. But the latter part of his life, he was in Rowan, R-O-W-A-N County, North Carolina. And if you Google his name, you'll see a picture of his tomb. It's in a church, it's in a Presbyterian churchyard.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that people would like to pose to Tom? All right, then before we go, I want to let you know, you may have noticed that I said we are going to be raffling off a book. So what I did is just pick a name, a number, or a letter out of the alphabet and said, okay, we're going to pick the letter P, and the person who is here with the last name starting with P. So as I look down the list, I see Bill Palm. So Bill, you will be receiving this lovely book signed by Tom Crocker, chock full of fascinating information about Napoleon and his entourage. It's quite interesting. And Tom, thank you so much for giving us a great glimpse of this. The other thing I want to mention is that our partner, Debbie Scheller from A Likely Story Bookstore in Sykesville, is offering anyone who would like to call the store, she will order you a book, one of Tom's special books, Empire's Eagles, at a 15% discount. So if you are interested, call Debbie and at A Likely Story Bookstore, and she will do that. Before we leave, I'm going to try to find a slide that has that information on it. Also, Tom is the author of Braddock's March, about Braddock coming here during the Revolutionary, or before the Revolutionary War. And do you want to mention that, Tom, at all? A few words about that?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of that's set in Maryland. He landed in Alexandria and across the Potomac River and marched straight up Wisconsin Avenue to Frederick, Maryland. And so there's a Maryland connection with that. And it's quite an interesting story of how he hauled all these huge cannon all across the mountains of Western Maryland into Pennsylvania. And of course, it wound up being a disaster, but it's an interesting story. That book was published in 2009, but it's still available on Amazon. And for those of you who like military history and some local history, I would commend it.
Excellent. Well, it sounds wonderful. I'm just going to share my screen with the information that you can use to, if you bear with me 1 minute, to order those books. There you go. You just call A Likely Story Bookstore in Sykesville, and you give them this code CCHS721 to receive a 15% discount. So I thank Debbie Scheller and the wonderful folks at A Likely Story Bookstore, Main Street. Their number is 410-795-1718, or you can go over to Beck's, have lunch, and visit the bookstore. Okay, Chris, if I can turn it over to you for any final remarks.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I very much appreciate it. I appreciate, Tom, your being with us today. We're always really honored with authors who have further research and further information for our members to learn more about history. I found it all so fascinating today. Thank you very, very much. And especially a little thanks to Lynn Wheeler. You know, people don't realize, but she works behind the scene tirelessly to get out the Zoom invites and to do some rehearsals. So thank you, Lynn, and the program committee.
Yeah, thank you.
Program committee always needs a little help, so you might want to consider volunteering with her to help bring these wonderful, wonderful events, you know, so they come off in flawlessly. One of the things I can announce today is that we're looking forward to going back to in-person box lunch talks in October. We're looking forward towards setting it up. We still have a few details to work out, but just so you know, we're aiming for that in October to get back together in person. But for August, we will be doing a Zoom box lunch talk on the Bella Rose and the Dianthus Bobby. And we have one of our very own volunteers and members, Brenda Marie Black, who will be presenting this box lunch talk. And it's about her grandparents. And I have to say that it just kind of warms my heart that we're dealing with, again, a very local story and a book. So you'll be able to understand a little bit more if you want to dive into the topic even more. That is August 17th. On September 10th, we have our Bluegrass Bourbon and Bocce event back out at Rob's Bluegrass Barn. Those tickets are available right now online at the discounted price of $40 a person if you get them in advance. At the door, it's more. And I will tell you, 2 years ago when we had this event, we sold out. So at the door wasn't even really an option. So get your tickets. It's a really fun event with food, bocce, and one of the very, very tippy top bands in the nation for bluegrass. And it's a fun evening for everybody. On Saturday, September 18th, we have another cemetery tour. For some reason, these cemetery tours are selling out. People are dying to get in there. So thanks for laughing, Lynn. Everybody else is on mute, and I'm assuming they're roaring. But the Deer Park Methodist Cemetery tour will be on the 18th. Those tickets are also available online. So two things you'll want to get in on early and buy your tickets, because again, our cemetery tours have been selling out. We will not be including the book this time. That's why the tour will be so much cheaper. It's only like $5 for members, but the book is available at the Maryland store right there at the cemetery if you want to buy that book. And then our September box lunch talk, Kathy and I are going to be teaming up and talking about the Sherman funeral that we'll be working on for October, which will be kind of a temporary exhibit for 3 weekends, where we'll be showing Elizabeth at her death in her home. I'm growing the rosemary right now in my garden to include as some of that early 19th century greenery that would be included. And Kathy and I will be talking a little bit about customs of death. And we also will be having a temporary exhibit here at Kimmy. So it'll be kind of our October effort. I don't want to say spooky because that doesn't sound very historical, but we will be getting in with the mood of fall. So with that, I invite you to stay close with us. Pay attention to what the stuff we send out. And I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thomas, thank you again. That was an outstanding talk, and I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to do it. Thank you very much.
You take care.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.